90%. That is the number from genetic studies of Wayuu communities in the interior Guajira Peninsula, a semi-arid stretch of land at the very top of South America where Colombia meets Venezuela at the Caribbean coast. 90% of the ancestry in those communities traces to pre-contact indigenous populations. Every surrounding Colombian indigenous group shows measurable European admixture from the colonial period. These communities show almost none. 5 centuries of colonial demographic mixing reshaped the genetics of every neighboring population. It did not move this number. That is the endpoint. Understanding how a community arrives at 90% indigenous ancestry in a region the Spanish entered in 1499 requires following 3 simultaneous lines of evidence: geographic, military, and biological, each of which explains part of what the others cannot explain alone. The clearest entry point into this story is the one this channel already mapped. The Taino video established that 61% of Puerto Rican maternal ancestry traces to pre-contact indigenous women who survived the colonial period. The Taino and the Wayuu share more than a DNA finding. They share an origin. Both descend from the Arawakan migration tradition that expanded northward from the South American mainland into the Caribbean over thousands of years. The Taino are the branch of that tradition that crossed the water and built civilization on the islands. The Wayuu are the branch that stayed on the mainland, in the peninsula closest to the Caribbean, carrying the same ancestral tradition in a geography the colonial system could not fully claim. The Wayuu are the largest indigenous group in Colombia, approximately 400,000 people living across the Guajira Peninsula and into Venezuela, holding a territory that straddles the international border in a way the Wayuu have never recognized as dividing anything. The border between Colombia and Venezuela is a political line drawn by 2 newly independent republics in the 19th century, across land the Wayuu have occupied since before either republic existed. The thing that stopped me earliest when I followed this evidence was not the DNA, it was what the language contains. The Taino language died in the early colonial period. While its specific vocabulary for the Caribbean world, words for hurricanes, hammocks, and canoes, was absorbed by Spanish and spread globally, the grammar and daily use were lost entirely, with no living speakers remaining to transmit it. The language family the Taino language belonged to, Arawakan, did not die with it. Wayuunaiki, the Wayuu language, is a member of the same family, the same ancestral grammatical tradition, the same Proto-Arawakan roots, a cognate relationship audible to anyone who studies both. And unlike the Taino language, Wayuunaiki is still spoken as a first language by most Wayuu children. 300,000 living speakers. The linguistic tradition the Taino carried northward into the Caribbean is still alive in the people the Taino left behind. This is more than a genealogical detail. It means the Wayuu's cultural continuity with the pre-contact Arawakan world is not reconstructed from archaeology or inferred from haplogroups. It is audible. It is being transmitted to the next generation. The Taino's linguistic heritage became extinct while the Wayuu maintained it. The divergence between the island tradition's extinction and the mainland tradition's survival has a traceable cause rather than a general one. I kept asking why, and the answer required going back to 1499 specifically. In that year, 7 years after Columbus first met the Lucayan in the Bahamas, Spanish ships arrived at Cabo de la Vela on the Guajira coast and established the first pearl fishing operations in South America. The Wayuu's coastal relatives were among the first South American indigenous people enslaved for pearl diving. The exact fate the Lucayan experienced on the Venezuelan pearl coast. The maritime skill that made Arawakan peoples valuable to the colonial pearl economy made them targets. The coastal Wayuu communities experienced colonial contact, enslavement, and demographic mixing from the first decade of the 16th century. The inland coastal split in the DNA is a geographic argument before it is a historical one. The Guajira Peninsula is one of the most inhospitable environments in South America, a semi-desert, extreme heat, scarce fresh water, terrain that offered the Spanish colonial system nothing it was looking for. No gold, no agricultural land viable for the crops that drove colonial plantation economics. No infrastructure that could support the kind of extraction the encomienda system was built to operate. The inland Guajira had no cash value to the colonial economy. The Spanish operated on the coast and left the interior largely alone for precisely the reason that the interior offered nothing worth the cost of controlling it. The economic logic of colonial extraction accidentally protected the communities beyond its profitable reach. The terrain's protection was accidental. The military campaign of 1769 was not. In that year, the Wayuu launched a coordinated military campaign against the Spanish colonial presence in the Guajira. They had been accumulating muskets for years through trade relationships with British and Dutch traders operating on the coast. The uprising was not a spontaneous response to a single provocation. It was a planned military operation using European weapons combined with Wayuú knowledge of the terrain. The result was the deaths of approximately 2,000 Spanish soldiers and colonists and the complete expulsion of the Spanish administrative and military presence from the peninsula. The Spanish colonial government never effectively re-established control. Subsequent attempts to re-enter the Guajira were met with continued armed resistance. The colonial administrative infrastructure that had been systematically transforming the demographics of the rest of Colombia, the missions, the encomienda assignments, the settlement patterns that put European men in indigenous communities and produced the admixture visible in every surrounding group's DNA, could not operate in territory the Spanish had been expelled from. The 90% is the genetic record of that expulsion. Every year the Spanish could not administer the interior. Guajira was a year in which the colonial demographic mixing could not reach those communities. Over the remaining decades of the colonial period and into the Republican era, the number compounded. The 90% is not a natural occurrence or a quirk of geography alone. It is the biological consequence of a military event in 1769, running forward through generations. What the Wayuu built culturally inside the space that rebellion created is the chapter one found hardest to explain simply because it operates in the same biological channel as the Taino's survival mechanism from a completely different direction. Their society is organized through matrilineal clans, Eirruku, where identity, inheritance, and legal standing all pass through the mother's line. A Wayuu person belongs to the mother's clan, not the father's. This cultural structure operated in the same biological channel that preserved indigenous ancestry in Caribbean populations. The 61% maternal haplogroup finding in Puerto Ricans reflects survival through the maternal line, specifically because colonial demographic mixing operated primarily through European male input into indigenous female lineages. The mitochondrial signal passing from mother to child regardless of the father's ancestry. The Wayuu's cultural insistence on matrilineal identity meant that the communities were specifically attentive to maintaining the maternal line's integrity across generations of contact period pressure. The cultural system and the genetic preservation mechanism aligned in the same biological direction, running the same way. The legal system the Wayuu built to govern the space the rebellion and the matrilineal structure preserved is where this story becomes something I did not expect to find at the end of a genetics video. In 2010, UNESCO recognized the Wayuu traditional conflict resolution system, the Püchipü, as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. The recognition acknowledged a legal tradition that had been governing 400,000 people for centuries without requiring external state infrastructure. The Püchipü uses trained word messengers who mediate disputes, including murders, through material compensation negotiated between clans. A system that prevents revenge cycles while encoding centuries of genealogical and precedent knowledge in oral transmission, in Wayuunaiki, within communities. 2010 requires reading two events simultaneously to understand what the year actually meant for the Wayuu. The Cerrejón coal mine, one of the largest open-pit coal operations in the world, located in the heart of Wayuu territory in the Guajira Peninsula, was documented in that period as affecting the water table in a peninsula already experiencing serious water scarcity. Children in Wayuu communities were dying of dehydration and malnutrition in a territory sitting above one of South America's most significant coal reserves. The most internationally recognized indigenous legal tradition in South America existed in the same territory where the state's mining interests were generating a water crisis. The traditional legal system had no mechanism to address. The Venezuelan economic collapse did not arrive after the coal mining crisis resolved. It arrived while that crisis was still building, in the same communities, in the same decade. The Venezuelan economic collapse beginning around 2015 added a different dimension. The Wayuu on the Venezuelan side of the border, which they do not recognize as a border, faced food insecurity, health service collapse, and displacement toward the Colombian side. Communities that had maintained the 90% finding across 5 centuries of colonial and republican pressure found themselves navigating a humanitarian crisis created by a state failure they had no role in producing, on a border they had been crossing freely since before the border existed. The genome that survived the 1499 Pearl operations and the systematic colonial pressure and the 1769 expulsion and the subsequent Republican administration is now under a different kind of pressure. The threat is not demographic mixing. It is the erosion of the land base and the language transmission conditions that made the 90% possible in the first place. The Colombian diaspora in the United States is approximately 1 million people. The Venezuelan diaspora has grown significantly since 2015. Both communities include people carrying DNA test results with indigenous ancestry, percentages their family narratives, from Bogota, from Caracas, from Maracaibo, cannot account for. The interior Guajira's 90% means that any Colombian or Venezuelan with ancestry traceable to the northern Caribbean coast may be carrying Wayuu Arawakan ancestry in their results. The 61% in a Puerto Rican DNA result and the unexpected indigenous percentage in a Colombian DNA result are pointing toward the same pre-contact Arawakan world. One branch crossed the water, the other stayed on the peninsula. Both ended up in the genome of the diaspora that descended from them. The Wayuu are a people whose genome is a living argument, one that the colonial system assembled the conditions to make without ever intending to. The 1769 rebellion removed the administrative mechanism that was diluting every surrounding community's indigenous ancestry. The Guajira's inhospitable terrain removed the economic incentive that would have brought that mechanism back. The matrilineal Eirruku structure directed the preservation through the biological channel, most resistant to colonial demographic mixing. The 1499 Pearl Coast contact split the population into coastal and inland outcomes, making the difference between exposure and protection measurable in haplogroup frequencies 5 centuries later. The Püchipü encoded the community's governance knowledge in the same language that carries the Arawakan tradition the Taino left behind when they crossed into the Caribbean. And the water rights crisis and the Venezuelan collapse arrived as the most recent chapters in a record that the colonial system, the republic, and the international community have all been writing in the Wayuu territory without the Wayuu's permission for over 500 years. Somewhere in the Guajira Peninsula right now, a child is learning Wayuunaiki as their first language. The same Arawakan family as the language Columbus heard in the Caribbean, and that no living person has spoken since the early colonial period. The language the Taino carried into the Caribbean is gone. The tradition it came from is not. The genome the Taino built their civilization with, the genome that the Wayuu's rebellion protected, the genome that the matrilineal Eirruku system reinforced across 5 centuries. It is still there. It is still being transmitted. Subscribe. Send this to someone who needs to know their ancestry has a living relative. Thanks for watching.